Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Brandau. I'm the artistic director of Princeton per Musica, and I am so happy today to be joined by composer James Whitbourn. And through the magic of Zoom, I'm in New York City and he's in Oxford, and we're able to talk to each other. I've invited him to speak with us today because Princeton per Musica will be performing his composition, Annelies, next month in March. And the libretto of that work by Melanie Challenger pulls together entries from the diary of Anne Frank and creates this beautiful work of art in its own right as a summary or a snapshot of Anne's life from before going into hiding, being in hiding, and then afterward. And James Whitbourn put music to that libretto. It's a very, very powerful work. It has affected all of us who are working on it right now, and we hope that it will land just as powerfully to you who come to hear it. There is, we will be doing the original full orchestra version of the work, and there are a number of spectacular commercial recordings of the chamber version of the work, including a beautiful performance by our friends at Westminster Choir College, Williamson Voices, led by James Jordan. But we don't have the opportunity to hear the work as it will be presented in March. And so I wanted to talk a little bit with James about how this work came to be, and specifically about the musical side of it, and what inspired him about the libretto and how he put it all together. So James, welcome. Thanks for being here. Much appreciated.
Thank you very
much. Can you just give us a very brief recap of how this work came to be in the first place?
Sure. You mentioned Melanie Challenger, and it was she who came to me with the idea, actually. 20 years ago this year, I had my first contact with her at the beginning of 2002, and she actually originally had the idea of doing something with the diary of Anne Frank, but wasn't very clear what. Originally, I think she had in mind maybe we'd do a children's opera or something, and it had come to her because she'd been working in Bosnia at the time with some children, which was war-torn at the time. And she had really seen firsthand the healing effect of music in that environment. And she had been so powerfully attracted to the thought of doing something with this Anne Frank text as a result of that work. At the time, she didn't know quite how difficult it was going to be to get permission to use the actual diary text. And for that reason, it was more the intention, I think, just to do something with the story of Anne Frank because of the difficulties of actually using the text. But she and I worked together very, very closely for a long period of time, actually honing ideas. It was something that was very interesting to me. I didn't immediately say yes, but I immediately said that I was very interested, and we talked and talked and talked, and over a period of time honed the idea a great deal, and it transformed actually to a different thing. And in the course of those conversations, it became really clear that if this piece was going to be a really worthwhile piece, we had to be able to use the diary. And that was the really difficult thing. But it was also a really wonderful thing, because it was the part of the story that took us into direct contact with Anne Frank's family, particularly her first cousin, Budi Elias, who then in turn became a great supporter of the project, and who came to the pre-premiere recordings that we made. Wow. And who came to the premiere and introduced it and remained part of the story throughout, and some of Anna's friends as well. So it was both a great complication, but also a great blessing that we decided to go down that route and see whether we could actually use the diary text itself.
Well, we're also lucky that that worked out, because as you say, it just to tell the story from an omniscient or third person point of view, it doesn't have quite the same power as the words themselves that were written with her hand, you know, on this document that survived. I want to talk, just before we get to the musical stuff, a little bit about maybe the kinds of things that you talked about with Melanie, and that is to say a dramatic arc or dramatic narrative and character itself. So did you actually go back and forth about which entries would be used and in what order, or was that her?
No. We very much went, it was a very collaborative effort. Melanie was the one who had this sort of the initial vision, and she also had been exposed to some of my music, and is one of those people who is very comfortable making her own decisions, if you know what I mean, and decided that I was the person that she wanted to work with on this. But having made that decision, we worked on it very closely together, and managed to shape the libretto in a way that was going to work for me as the person setting it as well. But she was always very sensitive to that. She always knew that it had to function in a particular way. She had an interest in singing herself, so there was never a tension there. It was always a really lovely collaboration.
Well, that's a gift. You have just described this work elsewhere. It's just a beautiful description. You're calling this musical portraiture through the medium of human breath. And I think most of the folks coming to this concert will be familiar with the portraits, the actual print portraits of Anne. And now we flesh that out with music. Do you remember when you were getting started writing the music, what did Anne sound like to you? You know, what was the characterization that you were trying to conjure through composition?
I'm not sure that I was consciously trying to conjure anything. I was trying, I think, to be responsive. So when I talk about a piece of portraiture, I mean that it's a portrayal of the person. It's a portrayal of this character. And I wanted it to be something, I wanted it to be a piece that people who knew her would recognize her in it. So actually the addition of Budi Elias, her cousin, into our process was a really important one, not because he was in any way hands-on or demanding, quite the reverse, but he was the person whose approval I suppose I craved most, as the person that was closest to her, and got. And I suppose within that portrayal, what I'm talking about, there are myriad references, little motifs, little musical things throughout the piece that relate perhaps to something else that she's written in the diary somewhere else, or to an anecdote which comes from some other bit of narrative around her. So, for example, in the orchestral version, you can hear this most clearly right at the very beginning of the piece, right at the top, and also introducing the movement, which is the dream later on in the work. But right at the very top, you hear these little tinkling bells. And I know that there's a story behind those. You don't necessarily have to know what the story is, but it's there. And it's that actually her friend Hannah Goslar, when she was talking about how she met Anne Frank in the first place, she said that she was in one corner of the room, Anna, and she was as a child, and she was playing these little bells, a little xylophone or something,
Oh,
in the
wow.
corner of the room, and that was the first memory that she had of her. So,
Oh, wow.
so it's full of things like that, which are part of, if you like, the portrayal of the person that you don't necessarily understand just through the oral reference, but there's an explanation for most things somewhere. So I just give you that one example.
Yeah, I'm sure that that specificity um, really made for a richer portrait, especially to those who knew her, and knew that situation. That kind of brings me into now the music and some of these choices. It's been such a rich experience to be working on this score and to see how you put it together, how you scored it, how it's orchestrated. And before we get to the specifics of that, I wonder if you could just talk for a minute about Anne's world of sound and how that relates to this piece, because it strikes me there's something of a paradox here at the heart of this endeavor, which is that she had to be very quiet, right? She could only sing in the evening, and at the same time that she had to restrain the amounts of sounds that she was making, sounds that came from without must have been more charged than just everyday sounds. And those everyday sounds, like the clocks and bell towers, reassured her. And so it strikes me that sound itself plays this kind of outside role in her experience in the annex. And did you find that challenging or interesting to have to represent both charged silence, right, and then these sudden outbursts of sound that must have been so intense for the family? What was that like in terms of building a sound world?
Well, when she first started writing the diary, of course, she was just a normal kid doing normal things. she she wasn't in captivity. And the thing about knowing Budi Elias is that there you get to know somebody that knew her as somebody that would go ice skating together, or go and do fun things. Um, so her world only became that sort of enclosed silence world, for those last 2 years, 2 and a bit years. And up until that point, she'd been used to a lot of exposure to all sorts of things, of course. And even in the annex, they were able to listen to the radio at certain times of day, and she was able to listen to music. And of course, they were able to talk to one another as well. So it wasn't always a silent place. But actually, while I was working on the piece, I had the opportunity to go to the annex.
Oh, wow.
And to go there one morning before the public was admitted. They very kindly just let me spend some time there, literally on my own. And it is a very different place when you're there in solitude. And I just spent some time listening to what silence means in that context, because silence is never actually silence. What it becomes is, or hardly ever silence, what it becomes is a heightened awareness of distant sounds, or of maybe closer sounds, but sounds that are not emanating from within your own space. And you relate to those in a very different way. They seem very, very important. So that when she was listening to the people shouting on the streets below, this would have been, I think, a very sort of extraordinary and aggressive and disturbing sound, even more than perhaps it might have been if you were in amongst it. Because I suppose your ears adjust in a particular way, just as your eyes do to light. Your ears adjust, and I found that even in the time that I was in the annex myself, I was able to perceive other sounds in a different way, and that was part of what went into the melting pot of my composition when I got to it.
That comes through very powerfully, I think, in the score and in the scoring, that there is this sense of external and internal, or first person and something beyond. And I wonder if we could talk for a minute about how that relates to, first of all, the instrumentation, and what led you to pick this particular instrumentation. So for those of you who haven't been working on this score, this is scored for single winds, flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon, 2 horns, 3 trombones, strings, piano, and quite a bit of percussion. I do a lot of arranging and orchestrating myself, and just love that moment of deciding, which paint colors are going to be on your palette, and what kind of paint. And it's so evocative what you've put together. And I wonder what drew you to these particular instruments. What kind of colors were you hoping to build?
I suppose of the range of instruments that you've mentioned, piano is the instrument that doesn't sit always in the orchestral symphony orchestra. It might be there in a piano concerto, but it wouldn't be a normal instrument. And if it were, it might be sort of sitting at the back. Whereas I've always encouraged the piano to be in a rather central position, or much more forward, or almost straddling the role of concerto occasionally, but much more frequently having more of a sense of leader about it, being quite a sort of intimate accompaniment component to this, particularly to the solo voice. So it's partly the color of the sound, and it's partly the associations and suitability for as an accompanying force. As to the brass forces, I can't really tell you why I didn't want to include trumpets in this particular piece, because I love the trumpet as an instrument, particularly in its low register. It can be a stunningly beautiful sound, but it just, I think I never felt the need for them in this particular piece. Mm-hmm. And if I had have done, I would have put them in. There wasn't a reason I couldn't, but I think I love the grouping of 3 trombones. I think that's a very evocative sound when they're working together, especially in a chordal way. And I found that those trombones and the horns, which is a horn is such a versatile instrument. It's got a huge range, and it's got in itself a huge palette of colors within the single instrument.
Right. I mean, within this piece, there are some gorgeous lyric moments for the horn, but then also, you're teasing out the opposite of that with all the stopped horn, right? And the intensity that brings. I think there's a really powerful use of the variety and the range of that instrument. I also am struck by the way that in a way that I respect and admire of Mahler, say, or Ravel, not everyone's playing at the same time, right? And
No,
there are these
totally not.
moments where it is just the piano, or a haunting passage with just the three trombones and these dissonant chords. It stands in such sharp relief to some of the more lyric solo passages for violin and oboe and these instruments we associate with melodic gesture. um, I I'm it's so engaging to work on this piece because there are so many different components and different choirs. I mean, we have a full chorus, and you've called for a concertante small chorus to
Yeah,
handle some
how are
other
you dealing
material.
with that, by the way?
We have a chorus of about 90 for the full ensemble, and then the concertante will be about 20 people pulled from within that.
Mm.
So there'll be just a different atomic weight to the two components there. And as I said, sometimes we have beautiful solo passages for the piano and for violin and cello and
Clarinet,
all
yeah.
kinds of and clarinet. And other places you use the strings as more of an atmospheric soundscape. And then there are also these moments, and I wonder if this is deliberate, that are very evocative of romantic music, or late 19th century sounds of the kind that maybe Anne was hearing on the radio. What different kinds of atmospheres did you have in mind as you set out to put this, or which came to be as you started to sketch this out?
Well, I suppose always in the forefront of my mind was the fact that this is a portrayal of a young woman using in part her own words, and therefore the words are very important, and I knew that I mustn't make sounds that obscure the clarity of the words. So thinning out the texture for quite a lot of the piece was important for that reason, so that the words can ping through through the chorus and the soloist, whoever's singing those words. And by the way, I mean, the part of Anne Frank is not confined to the solo voice. The part of Anne Frank is the whole piece, choir and choirs and soloists. And then beyond that, I think the orchestration picks up as exactly as you've suggested. Some of the sound worlds that I was wanting to pick up on, that she has herself identified. There's one entry, for example, where she talks about a beautiful Mozart concert that she'd heard on the radio. It's not a diary entry that's in the libretto, but it's in the diary. And this is one of the instances, for example, where I've taken something from another part of the diary and put it in just as a sort of musical reference in. So there are kind of two Mozartian moments that I've deliberately put in there, because in honor of that particular reference that she had made as being something that had touched her soul in a particular way. And there's a chord sequence in there which you don't even necessarily know is there. I'd have to tell you exactly where it was. You wouldn't necessarily know that it's there, but it's there. And so these sort of things go into the mix and then create the whole.
Yeah. Again, that's so rich to learn that you were able musically to incorporate more of Anne's world, even if they're not a part of these particular entries. One of the textures that was very striking to me, and I I imagine in performance, in live performance, ends up being quite stark, is plain chant. And of course, you have done a lot of work on plain chant, and you've published with my colleague James Jordan a book about plain chant and the use of it in choral settings. What drew you to that that texture in the context of this work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether I would go as far as identifying it as plain chant, because it's not based on any particular historic chant.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that choral monophony is a very powerful vehicle for certain types of words.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have discovered that choral monophony works very powerfully in a liturgical context,
Mm-hmm.
as monks and others have discovered down the centuries. And yes, I studied plain chant quite a lot with Dr. Mary Berry many years ago, and it's been part of my study and life. But I think compositionally here, it's more the single non-harmonized voice, and the fact that you then can create a weaving melody that tells a very direct story at certain moments in this piece. And I think that's what I've tried to do, more than evoke a sort of quasi-historical use of plain chant as such. I think if you think of it as monophony,
Mm-hmm.
choral monophony, and think what power that can bring to the to the meaning of the text at that moment, that is maybe more where I'm going.
Yeah, and for those who will come to hear this, that texture of choral monophony is reserved for very particular moments that strike me as moments that could be in a different work with a different focus, scored in a bombastic way, right? On Sunday, Amsterdam was bombed, the planes dived and climbed, the air was above with the drone of engines. I mean, you have in the orchestra you call for in this work plenty of instruments that can make a whole lot of racket. But at that moment, as we're sort of rounding dramatically the corner on the arc, it's delivered so straightforwardly, right, through that monophonic texture, that it strikes me at least as a very direct and haunting choice for that moment. I'm interested to see how that plays out in live performance. You have alluded to it a little bit already, but I'm also really fascinated working through this piece with our singers and soon with the orchestra, just as a complement to some of the textures and the scoring decisions, some of the harmonic decisions or the pitch language. That, as you said, there are some things that are a bit Mozartian. There are some things that strike me as being late 19th century, Austro-Hungarian, or maybe I sometimes even hear what sounds a little bit like Dvorak, sort of these circle of fifth progressions. And then there are other passages, and we as a chorus have been working quite a bit on our whole tone
Movement
scales.
7, no doubt.
and singing augmented chords, and where you plane the augmented sonorities up and down, and there is this that is sometimes used to portray an ominous moment because there's no anchor, right? We don't have those half steps in the mode defining major or minor.
Right.
We kind of don't know where we are. And I wonder if you could just talk for a moment about, which sorts of pitch collections you went for as you were trying to create this drama.
Well, what I do typically when I'm working on a piece like this is I keep a notebook. I make up a notebook for myself with manuscript paper on one side and the text on the other. And in a piece like this, it was sort of movement by movement. And I think I build up over a period of time what seems right and what I keep coming back to as ideas. And I think I give these ideas time so that I can, I can test whether I start to dislike them or whether they start, in which case I cross them out, or whether they just seem as if, okay, that is the partnership now. So to some extent, there are probably deliberate choices, but to some extent it's an instinctive thing that you build up a toolkit of techniques over the years, and then instinct kicks in as to when to use which bit at any particular time.
Mm-hmm.
And I do pay a lot of attention to what my sort of inner feeling tells me, that if it feels right, it probably is right. And if I start to have that kind of sinking feeling, I try and get rid of it as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And I think, the movement that you're probably talking about, which is it's quite a difficult thing in some ways, or at least it needs the biggest learn, is movement 7, mm-hmm. Which is the one which is immediately before the Kyrie Sinfonia, which is perhaps the sort of most striking single listen, but when it's heard in conjunction with the movement before, it's a completely different piece. And I think, to go back to your question about the choral monophony, I put all emotion, I think, as it's turned out, into the false alarms. And then when the capture actually happens, it's very calm and understated. So it's all about, actually the fear of capture is more dramatic than the capture itself. So it's all about, can you imagine living in that state of fear for that long? Knowing that if you are found out, you've seen what happens to the people because you've seen them down below. And this is a sort of unimaginable fear. And I suppose I've just tried to use the things that I have at my disposal to try and portray that and convey that and put it into the picture.
Well, I think the choices are inspired and very powerful, and we have a few weeks left to try to ensure that we will do our part to bring that vision into being, all of course in the service of Anne's words. And I wonder if we could just wrap up with a thought about what this kind of experience, what the experience of revisiting history through music can do for us, because there of course is a sense in which nothing can capture the injustice and the horror of of the bigger story that Anne Frank is a part of, right? That just the senseless slaughter of millions of people. But there's some sense in which a piece of music like this, which, because of the design of the libretto, because of the power of the music, both of which were informed by people who actually knew this person, this young woman, has some capability to take us back there with her, to help us understand the scope of this. To what extent, I mean, do you feel that a piece like this has that role to play, in terms of keeping history, I don't want to say alive, but keeping history in our mind and as an ongoing thing?
I mean, it's very pertinent at the moment. What I should say, that we have to bear in mind is that the writing itself is brilliant. I mean, Anna Frank, what an extraordinary young woman she was, and to be able to write in the way that she did was quite extraordinary. And I think there have been so many beneficiaries of her work ever since. Because although she was only one of, as you say, millions and millions of people who were killed, I think people find it easier to understand the story of one person in that way, rather than to see a great sweep of too many people for them really to comprehend. And so I think in her writing, in the brilliance of her writing, she has been able to be a sort of representative voice of a much greater whole, in that way. I don't think I would want to claim that the piece is about the Holocaust or representative of anything more than it actually is. And that's why I call it a portrait, because in a way, the author of the work is Anna Frank, and I'm writing her portrait in music. But writing it in, I think what a choral piece does is two things. One, it brings together a large community of people who are thinking about the same thing simultaneously. And I'm talking about, of course, in rehearsal, that'll be the choir. In performance, it's the choir and the audience. And it's a really powerful thought, I think, to, just to step back and think, actually, 400 people in this room, or whatever it is, that we're all thinking about exactly the same thing at the same moment. And that is something that choral music can do. The other thing it does is it gives a time frame. The piece lasts about 75 minutes. It's a whole concert. And that means that for that amount of time, everybody concerned is putting their full attention onto that one person. It's quite a long time, actually, to be, if you were looking at a visual portrait, you might only be looking at it for 2 minutes, and then you might move on to a different picture. But actually, it's a discipline to be there all together in the moment, for quite a substantial period of time. And that's the responsibility of composers, to use that time carefully, of course, which I hope I've done.
No, I couldn't agree more on both of those points. It's something I've talked about quite a bit, that choral performance, rehearsal, and then performance does hold that singular power, right? To bring all those people together, to listen, to harmonize, to communicate. It's about the things that flow between them, right, and not about any one individual participating. And I think I'll close just by saying, on your second point, um, I am finding myself in this preparation period very inspired and reinvigorated about the choral repertoire in the way that you say that it can, in a given bound of time, focus us on one extraordinary person and their story. I think about the challenge, for instance, of preparing and performing Elijah, which this choir did maybe 6 years ago, and the challenge of that portrayal. And of course, we're coming up on a season where we had the opportunity to hear Bach's Passions, and I hope that there are other librettists and composers out there who will find other stories to examine in this way, and to create those portraits, because it is a uniquely powerful medium, and there are certainly so many stories out there to be told, if we can find them. So I want to thank you not just for your time today and your many eloquent words about this piece, but for the endeavor itself. We hope that this will be meaningful to all of those who come to hear it. I know it has already been a very extraordinary experience for those who are preparing the work, and it's a very fine example of what our art form can do. So a big thank you to you, and
Well, thank you. And I mean,